Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to talk about degenerate art. And I'm going to focus on, of course, comic book art. And this is prompted by the recent covers that Frank Miller has done for Marvel. And a lot of people are looking at them saying he's really not bringing his A game, or he's trolling Marvel, or simply these are just awful. And then you have the people on the other side saying, leave Frank Miller alone. You should pay him some respect for all he's done for comics. Or he's using a stylized form of art that you as a lowbrow can't even perceive. All these kinds of things. Now, I'm going to delve into all of that, but I'm not going to answer that question. I'm not going to hopefully fall on one side or the other. I'm going to try to be objective. But what I really want to look at is how this Frank Miller art is being used by Marvel because they think in a degenerate way, according to art and according to morality. But before we get there, I just want to let everyone know that there are 3 links in the description, and I'll try to put them in the pinned comment as well. They are for my 3 graphic novels. There is a second chance campaign up for my completed graphic novel, Thomas Valiant. There is an open campaign right now for The Valiant Heroes, which is my second book, and there is an early bird sign-up page for my new graphic novel, which the campaign will be opening on the 4th of July. It is CROM the Destroyer. And I very specifically use traditional, realistic-looking, beautiful art for my books. You have Renzo Rodriguez doing most of Thomas Valiant and The Valiant Heroes. He is basically an early John Byrne from his time on Iron Fist, or an early George Perez, looking at his stuff back in the early JLA. And for CROM the Destroyer, I have Jim O'Reilly and Nick Axe doing the penciling. They're a combination of John Buscema and early Barry Windsor Smith. And I have the comic great Mike Gustovich, who's worked on everything from Batman to the Avengers, doing the inking for that book as well. You're looking at some of that beautiful art in the background, so if that looks or sounds appealing to you at all, click on those links in the description or the pinned comment and go on over and see if my graphic novels are for you. Alright, so I'm going to start talking a little bit about Marvel, then I'm going to talk about the logical definition of art, going a little bit into logic itself, see how art itself derives from those rational and logical principles, then move on to talk about specific art from different artists, including Frank Miller, and then I'm going to move back into current comics, focusing a little bit on Marvel, and show how they use degenerate art and why they use degenerate art. So here's the thing about Marvel, Marvel being the big boy on the block for comic production. A lot of people might not get this because they just look at Marvel stuff and see how awful it is, but Marvel does actually hand choose its artists for very specific reasons, and it says no to some great artists, and it actually does edit its art. I know, shocking, but true. So the thing is, they will choose some older artists to try to sell their books. They use Alex Ross, and now they've used Frank Miller, but there are other great artists from the past that they will not use, that have gone to them and said, listen, I can do some work for you. I'm thinking most noticeably about Walter Simonson, who has gone to them and said that, and has then said that Marvel said to him that no, they don't want his art anymore because audiences no longer want his art. So I fully realize that partly this is Marvel being cheap because, well, they don't have a lot of money because their books don't sell. And quite honestly, Marvel hires cheap artists. You can see over the last at least 5 years when they do their Stormbreaker collection little thing, they take these new artists for Marvel and they showcase them every year. They're called Stormbreakers. And usually when you look at it, I've looked at it for the last at least 5 years, I think, you can see that there are about 10 to 15 names on the list, and only about 1 or 2 of them will be from North America, or even the entire English-speaking world. And you might say, well, they're just being international, that's just good business sense. But if you look quite specifically of the countries where these artists are from, you'll see and notice a pattern repeating itself over and over again, which is to say they go to places where the American dollar, according to the comparison with the local dollar, is very, very healthy. Therefore, they're paying these people peanuts as compared to what they would pay someone in North America. So I realize that that works, and the reason why they would pay probably through the nose for Alex Ross is because people will simply buy a book without even opening the darn thing up because it has an Alex Ross cover. And I think Alex Ross is the exception to the rule. But they won't use most other artists because they don't have that pull of Alex Ross. They won't buy a comic just because it has this cover. And so it is my estimation that they're using Frank Miller now, and probably, again, paying through the nose, partly because he will have some draw, but mostly because his current art fits with their degenerate style of art. Now, whether or not it actually fits with it or just appears to fit with it, we'll get into that in a little bit. Now, before going any further, let's talk about the word degenerate itself. It usually has two different meanings, which people bring to their mind when they think about it. Number one being degenerate in that you are acting in an immoral way, and two, the more basic form of degenerate is to destroy the form of what the thing actually is. It is my estimation, and my channel really has gone on about this for years now, that all of the comic industry right now, especially Marvel, is looking for degenerate art. That is to say, art that breaks down the natural form of things because they are morally degenerate. That being said, I'm not going to talk about that moral degeneracy again until the end of this video. I'm going to talk about degeneracy in the idea that it is a breaking down of a form. And also, I want to stress, I'm not an art expert in any way, shape, or form. I am your common everyman that's going to look at this. Now, I know things about logic and I know things about storytelling, and that's what I'm going to focus on and analyze this through, not through being a art critic in any way. And I think that's important because we're looking at this through the eyes of the regular people who are buying these books, and a lot of people are saying, this looks awful. So, first off, logically, what is the definition of art? Art, logically, is the ability to take an idea from your mind and to translate it into external matter. Now, first of all, you got to realize that this encompasses a wide range of things. Architecture is therefore an art. Shipbuilding is an art. What we're looking at right here, which are pictures on a page, is a representation of reality, which is usually an intermediate step between taking that idea from your mind and bringing it into external matter. For shipbuilding or architecture, it would be a blueprint. We're looking at artistically the work that's put down on a page by Frank Miller or other artists, and this would be a representation of reality. But the logical definition of art itself, as I just gave, can be broken down, and if you really want to understand it, must be broken down in order to look at each specific part. Because what is an idea in itself? Well, an idea is a form. Number two, what do you do with that form if you want to bring it into external matter? Well, you have to use the rules of reality itself. You have to understand reality and its rules in order to use them, in order to bring this form into existence in external matter. And if you simply cannot do that, then that form, that idea in your mind, is of something that is not real. And yes, I realize there is a future wherein we might be able to do things that we can't do right now. That has to do with whether or not a thing is impossible or improbable. That's an entire separate argument, but I do realize that it exists. But the point being, with the definition of art itself, you'll see that forms can only exist in the real world if they work in conjunction with reality and the rules of reality. That is to say, there is a normal way within which forms exist. And that's the thing which your progressive people, quote unquote progressive, would hate, because normal is a dirty word in today's progressive culture. And actually, I read a CBR article about this entire thing about Frank Miller, and I thought that I was going to disagree severely with him by his title, because he's talking about how modern audiences are too picky in what they want and are too focused on reality, all this kind of thing. But actually, when I read it, I would say, yeah, he hits on points which I am going to hit on here, and I thought about myself, and he is correct, except for the fact that he won't admit that the standard for comics is realism because it's a reflection of reality, and reality has norms. He tries to obfuscate that point specifically. And the fact that reality has norms shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. This is what our entire idea of science and technology is based upon. It's based upon the fact that there are set rules to reality. They don't change on a whim. They don't change because people like or think them. They don't change by themselves. There's no independent little god in each one of these things that makes it do things that it's not supposed to do. All of this kind of thing. It's objective, it exists, and it follows rules time after time after time. That is to say, there is a normal way reality exists. There's a normal way within which each thing within reality exists. And you can say that by saying each of these things and the whole in itself has in itself a form, a blueprint by which it works. And if you go outside of that blueprint, especially in ways that are going to be very contradictory to it, the thing is simply not going to work. Now, from this point, which is the understanding of the logical definition of art itself, we draw two things. Number one being the fact that beauty is not subjective. Logically, beauty is taking the form of the thing and giving an example of it par excellence. The more the thing that you create is a reflection of the original form of that thing, the more beautiful it is. And last time I said that, I had these weirdos in the comments saying, oh, beauty is subjective. You have no idea what you're talking about. I usually find such people confuse the idea of what beauty is. Now, I understand. According to Aristotle, within his Greater Ethics, you go right back to the first chapter of it, you can understand that the ends of a thing can be seen objectively and subjectively. Objectively in how it exists, and subjectively in how it is used. I usually find that people who say things like art are purely subjective are utilitarian people, and not only that, but utilitarian in things only exist in order to serve me. Therefore, they must be completely subjective. While I understand that that form of use of a thing is subjective, that doesn't mean the things in themselves, like beauty, are subjective. They exist in themselves, these forms of a thing, these patterns of a thing, reality itself as reality exists, and the rules of reality exist according to a specific pattern by which they exist, which is the form of the thing. And if you, again, have a reflection in reality of the form of the thing, which is par excellence, that makes it beautiful, or more and more beautiful as you get closer and closer to that form. And further to that, I can understand that, yes, within the last couple of 100 years, most people don't think that way. But that doesn't change the fact for at least the last 2,500 years, Western civilization has said beauty exists objectively, and it's one of the pillars by which our entire civilization, which again includes things like science and technology, exist. The other thing that has to be looked at is how forms are viewed within logic itself. Logic really is the tracing of form from form. That's what reason and logic are meant to do. Because reason and logic are to trace back cause and effect from one thing to another, so that you can see the ultimate cause of a thing by following it from its proximate cause, which is what you have in front of you, upwards to where it actually came from, and then back downwards in order to reorganize your thoughts according to understanding the principles of where a thing comes from. But how do you do that? How do you follow cause and effect, cause and effect? Well, you do that through forms. Because one of the principles of how forms exist within reality, the reality that we all live in, is that like forms beget like forms, and like forms only beget like forms. And this is part of the entire basis of logic that I'm always talking about, those steps that necessarily need to be there, which are simple apprehension, judgment, reason, and then logic. Simple apprehension is looking at the form of a thing. You want the definition of the thing, but it's much more deep than that. It's the quiddity of the thing. It's the form of the thing as it exists in itself objectively. Then you make a judgment about that thing saying, this form and that form are the same, or this form is contained within that form. And then you can move on to reason and logic and make arguments like the fact that if form A is contained in form B, and form B is contained in form C, then form A is contained in form C. And quite specifically, if you're trying to make a reasoned, logical argument, and you go from this form begets an entirely new form, that's a break in reason and logic. So, if you have a human being, there is a form of human being, a human nature, and human beings beget or generate other human beings and only other human beings. And horses beget or generate other horses, dogs beget dogs. And from that point, you might be beginning to see why your quote-unquote progressive people hate logic and reason. Why? Because they think to themselves things like, if I think I'm a dog, then I'm a dog. No, I'm sorry. You were begotten by a human being. If you had offspring, they would be human beings. You are a human being. Why? Because you have the form of a human being. You were generated from that form, and you will generate that form if you beget it again. Or more to the point, let's look at the generation that occurs within every human being. Everyone's cells generate new cells, and that generation of new cells is exactly according to the form, according to the blueprint by which you exist. If your cells are XX, they produce XX cells. If your cells are XY, they generate the form of XY cells. It is going to happen that way according to the blueprint. It doesn't matter how you feel. It doesn't matter what you get done to yourself. It doesn't matter what chemicals you pump into your body. That's the generation of cells that's going to occur, because that's the norm by which reality exists. So, with all of that talk about forms, you can see that the attempt to break down a form is what we call degeneration. Because again, form begets form. Form generates form. What you're trying to do is hamper the generation of that form. Just as beauty is the presentation par excellence of that form, the attempt to destroy the form itself, it's an attempt because really can't be made, the attempt to do so is degeneration. It is degeneracy. And again, usually, since you actually cannot destroy a form, the attempt is being made in order to make people believe that that form no longer exists or that it can exist in a different way, etc., etc. Now let's take all of that understanding and look at this art that Marvel is using or will not use, and try to understand how this art fits into this entire way of logically defining what art is. But before we specifically get there, I want to talk about something which was pointed out to me by Graham Nolan. Specifically, if we're looking at comic book art, it can be broken down into sections. There is sequential art, and then there is illustration. Sequential art is more than one illustration that tells a story. Now, an illustration can tell a story in itself, but it's not sequential art. And if you're looking at illustration itself, it can be further broken down into, as he described it to me, an illustration that does tell a story, and an illustration which he calls an evergreen cover. That is to say, this is an illustration that you can slap on any book because it really doesn't have anything to do with the story that's being told inside. So I just wanted to say that very briefly and keep that in mind while I go over the artists themselves. So, if you look again at Alex Ross, you'll see that he is someone who uses form par excellence. And how does he do that? Well, I'm actually subscribed to Alex Ross on YouTube. He has a channel. You can listen to how he does things, how he creates art. What he does is he generally uses models. So I'll try to put up a picture in the background, I think of Harley Quinn and the Joker. Now, for this piece and other pieces like it, what does Alex Ross do? He gets two people to come in and pose in this exact pose, people of the right height, the right body size, and he even puts clothes on them so it accentuates some lines that he wants to accentuate. He takes a picture of that and then he copies it onto his piece of paper, his canvas, and makes the picture of it. So what is he doing? He's making a piece of art which is a representation of reality, and he's using reality itself as his basis to do that. Now, he can do it by himself. He can have these forms in his mind about how these people should actually exist if they want to do that, because he does do sequential art, and he can't have people posing for every last picture. But yeah, he goes back to reality. Now let's look at someone quite different. Let's look at Walter Simonson, who I also follow on social media and get to peer into the things that he does in order to create art. Walter Simonson's art appears to be very angular, but it's not just angular, it's very shape-driven. You can see his use of shapes over and over again. Is this a degeneration of art because he's not following the norm of how these forms exist? Well, to some extent, you could call it that. But to another extent, what he's doing is he's using a form of storytelling within the art itself. That is to say, he's not just telling a story with the sequential art or with the illustration, but he's helping to tell a very specific story by how the art itself exists and is presented. What am I talking about? Well, let's look at how you draw a picture. Let's go back to How to Draw Things the Marvel Way, or any other book that you might pick up about basic art form. You'll see that they tell you to do the basics by breaking everything down into shapes. You break it down into a circle, you break it down into a square, a rectangle, a triangle. If you get more complicated, you break it down into cylinders, etc., etc. And this is what Walter Simonson is doing. He's taking the forms that make up the things that he is presenting, and he's not hiding the fact that those shapes exist within those things that he's presenting. Quite the opposite. He is emphasizing the fact that those shapes make up these forms, which is to say, the form of this shape is a part of the form of the human being, and therefore he's following these forms in a through line to present the picture itself or the sequential art to the audience. And why is he doing this? Well, I would say the reason why he's doing this is he's allowing the audience to see the more pure and basic forms within which the things exist in order to tell a story with those forms, which is to say, he's dealing usually in his stories with raw power. It's no accident that I would say his greatest and most beloved run was on Marvel's Thor, which is a character which is the personification of raw natural power. And so his use of shapes in this way, especially with this character, is bringing the reader's mind back to this is a character of power, and not just of power, but raw power. And he can emphasize that by emphasizing the forms of shapes that exist within the forms of the things that he's presenting. Now let's look at two other artists who do this similar thing, but in a different way. I would say artists like Marc Silvestri and Mark Texeira, they use lines, not shapes themselves, but lines in order to portray a gritty quality to the storytelling that they're engaged in with their illustrations and sequential art. Marc Silvestri, I would say, uses lines very specifically, and Mark Texeira, he simply, in some kind of way, I don't know how exactly, tries to leave the rough lines of the pencils in there in the completed art, both of which these things bring the human mind back to this is much more basic, therefore it applies itself to the gritty quality of the stories that they tell. And before I get into Frank Miller, there's another thing that I have to say. You'll see that just as logic, I would say, harkens back to Euclidean geometry, so all the things that I've been talking about here harken back to a understanding through Euclidean geometry of how reality exists. It starts with definitions, and you move from the most simple to the more complex. The most simple being what is a point. Then you move on from point to line. Then you move on from line to angle. Then you move on from angle to plane. Then you move on from plane to shape. A point is a fixed position that exists without height or breadth or width. It has to be an imaginary point, but that's what a point is. And a line is a connection of two or more points. And an angle is a combination of two or more lines. And a plane is a combination of lines that encompass a specific area. And a shape is a plane that has very specific angles, lines, etc., etc. In my estimation, the artists that I just talked about are employing these simple parts of geometry in order to tell the story or help tell a story which is very specific. You have Marc Silvestri. He is employing a line over and over again, which is something the human mind can harken back to and understand as simplistic. Walter Simonson is employing shapes to do the same thing. But if you look at Frank Miller's art, especially within his later career and certainly now, what he is doing is he's using angles. But there are two things to pull out of this. Number one, is the fact that, yes, he's using angles the same way that I would say Mark Silvestri is using lines in order to bring about a more gritty quality, in order to tell the story with how the art itself is presented, not just what he is presenting. But here's the thing about angles. Angles would be the most complex thing within human understanding, not within geometrical shapes or anything like that, but within human understanding to use to present this quality. Why? Because you can only bend a line so much before you turn it into an angle, or you turn it into part of a shape, like a semicircle, things like that. And you can only take shapes and bend them so far in order to do the same thing. But with angles, you got 180 degrees to play with until you bring it back to a line. And then you can flip it over and you have another 180 degrees. So you can have 360 different ways to use these angles. And again, that's much more complex than the simplicity of a line or the simplicity that you get within shapes. Now, here's where I'm going with this entire thing. Is this degeneration of art itself? Well, to some extent, I would say you can make that argument that it is degenerative art for any of these artists that I've been talking about, except I think would be for Alex Ross. But again, you can also, like I've just presented, look at it in the way that they're telling a story through how the art is presented, not just what is presented in the art. And so this is simply a part of storytelling that has been brought into the art itself. But here's the problem with that, and I'll compare it to actually writing a story. If you have a story, and I deal in science fiction and fantasy, if you look at these according to logic, what is it? Well, you're entering a if-then proposition within your logical argument. You're saying, if this was to exist, then how would the rest of reality, and especially human existence, proceed from that? But here's the thing, if you've ever worked with professional editors, and I have within my manuscript for my novel, which again, I'm hoping to bring to Baen Books to see if it can get published, or if not, maybe publish it in a comic or manga format. But anyway, the point is that if you work with an editor, an actual professional editor, they will say, look, you can't bring this in all of a sudden. This is a deus ex machina. You can't do that. The reason why they could do that in ancient Greece was because their society understood about how the gods actually enter into, or how they believed gods entered into their reality, so it was already set up for them. But you can't do that in modern storytelling, because you have to set it up so that the reader understands that this is how your reality works. If you present something to an editor and you don't lay down the foundation of how your reality is different from our reality in order for the audience to understand that before they're presented with something that is according to this other reality, then they're going to throw it back in your face and say, fix it, redo it, get rid of it. You can't write a story this way. And this is what I see going on with the art of Frank Miller and the rest of these artists, even Walter Simonson and others. You see, they're telling a part of the story, again, through how the art is presented, as well as through what they present in the art. But since they're employing story, and they're moving outside of the form which naturally exists according to reality, they need to set up, just like you would in telling a story, and your editor would throw back in your face if you didn't do it. For your audience, you need to set this up in order for them to understand it. And when you're working on a sequential art book, which is a comic, and you do it over and over again, and you're there for a number of years, sure, it works. You bring your audience up to speed. You show them the things which are necessary for them to understand that this is what you're doing, even if it's in an instinctual way. Or if you're just an illustrator or a painter, you can do so by producing this kind of art over and over again, and then presenting it to your audience that way. But you need to set up that basis by which you inform your audience in some way, shape, or form that this is what you're doing in order to deviate from the normal form of what exists, because you're employing a fanciful technique in order to accentuate something within your story, which would be seen as science fiction and fantasy if you were just telling a pure story, not using art. So here's the problem with all of these people who are complaining that everyone should leave Frank Miller alone, or that you just don't simply understand his art. It's because these people have been there for decades and decades. They've experienced his art. They've been taught this. They've been given the tools to understand that this is what he's doing. But if you're looking at it from a normal perspective of someone who does not know Frank Miller, and he hasn't been around in comics in this way for quite some time now, he's only done small things or out of the way things that not a lot of people would be picking up, then no, they're not going to recognize this, that he took his entire life and his entire body of work to get to this point in order to present it to his audience. They're not going to understand that. Why? Because they are human beings. They have a natural default called reality by which they understand the forms of things, and this doesn't compute. And I would go so far as to say that if this was the cover for a Frank Miller book where he did the exact same thing and presented it to his audience in this way, you wouldn't have this backlash at all. But again, you have the problem that this is a illustration, not part of the sequential art in itself in the inside, and on top of that, a evergreen cover which can be slapped on anything. So you're moving farther and farther away from storytelling itself while trying to employ a method of storytelling which is extremely complex and expecting people who have never seen it before to actually understand what is going on. It doesn't work that way. Now, as I said at the first, whether or not this type of art for Frank Miller or any of the rest of these artists is degenerative art, you can make that determination yourself. You can make that argument yourself. I probably would like to actually hear that argument, but I'm not going to make that argument here. Except for the fact that you'll see that this takes an enculturation, as it were, in order to get the audience to understand. And it takes a certain amount, therefore, of sophistication on the part of the audience. And I'm sorry, but modern day people are not that sophisticated in order to understand art. And it's not their fault. Just like the fact that we've been philosophically illiterate for the last couple of centuries, so we have become more and more artistically illiterate as we proceed closer and closer to this point in history, which we are at right now, because people have been trying to push degenerate art and degenerate ways of looking at the world. And this brings me back to my point at the first. You see, I think that Marvel is employing Frank Miller in order to do these evergreen covers because his ideas are so complex that they appear to be fitting in with the normal standard of Marvel art, which is based upon degeneracy. And why and how is Marvel degenerate in how it presents its art? Well, it's pretty simple, and I've hinted at it before when I talked about like things begetting like things. You'll see that progressivism is progressing towards a very specific thing. It is a form, progressivism that is, it is a form of socialism, communism, which is proceeding towards a utopian society, or in their minds at the very least, is proceeding towards a utopian society. But here's the thing that most people don't understand about this progress of progressivism. Again, put those in quotation marks. They think to themselves, well, they're trying to build a utopia. Isn't that a laudable thing? Isn't that something praiseworthy? Well, you have to look at how they're trying to do it, and that's the real rub. Philosophically and logically, if you understand where their ideas come from, they're not trying to build a utopia. Their philosophy is based upon the idea that utopia exists naturally. But here's the problem. Utopia is a state whereby only round pegs can fit into, and human beings right now are square pegs. Therefore, how do we get human beings to fit into utopia? Well, you whittle the square pegs down to a round peg in order for them to fit into utopia. That is to say, you use societal and political forces to shape and bend human beings to mash them up into whatever form you need to get them to be in order for them to fit into this utopia that already exists within nature. And that mindset cannot exist if you believe that forms of things exist, if you believe there is a norm for things, if you believe there is a human nature, which is the form of humanity, because it's a fixed thing that can't be changed. You see, human beings need to be a amorphous lump of clay that can be turned into whatever these people want to, again, by political and societal forces. And if you break down what that means, it means that the idea of form is absolutely contrary to progressivism, which leads to the fact that ideas of beauty are absolutely contrary to progressivism. That ideas of normalcy are absolutely contrary. That ideas that are based upon that stuff like science and technology, as we understand it right now, are completely opposed to the idea of progressivism. Therefore, if progressivism is the only thing that they must push, you gotta get rid of all of these things. How do you get rid of these things? Through degeneracy. And again, you can't actually degenerate the forms of these things if they exist in that way. You're just degenerating the way that people can understand that they exist and that reality has these forms and that they work in a very specific way according to reality. You're just degenerating the people around you and their understanding, and that's what progressivism does. And that degeneracy, which is the breaking down of the form or the understanding of the form of the thing, leads into the other definition of degeneracy, which is to say they are immoral. Why? Because they do this through political forces. It's all about power politics. And what is politics? If you look at it logically, politics is public morals. Therefore, they're breaking down the public morals in order to break down understandings of forms and how they exist, of reality and how it's based upon forms and all of these things, so that they can, in the end, shape and bend human beings to their will so that they can put them into this utopia that they say exists. Now, that's their argument, but I would say that this is a back-ended argument. That's the one that they give after having taken it from the point that they actually want and reversing the entire thing to make it look like they're being altruistic in some way. They're not. The beginning point of this entire thing is they themselves want to be degenerate, they want to be immoral, therefore they come up with this entire system in order to justify their own immoral acts, their own immoral and degenerate way of wanting to exist. And what does this have to do with comics? And what does this have to do with entertainment as a whole? Well, I take the comic industry as being a good example, a microcosm of the rest of the entertainment industry. And if you look at the comic industry, it is heavy progressive. Everyone in control there is a heavy progressive. They've said over and over again, and I've covered this on my channel over and over again, they've made statements on their podcast about how pushing progressivism is exactly what they're doing within their art. And at the same time, I've listened to so many podcasts, specifically from Marvel, where you have editors talking to each other and groups of editors and multi-generations of editors for the last 20 years talking about how they specifically edit the art. And how does that editing, pray tell, take place? Well, it takes place through cognitive dissonance that you have to be a progressive, and through the fact that you just corrupt things that already exist because you can't create yourself, because you don't work with the rules of reality. And what they say is, well, look, everyone presents their own art according to their own subjective way of viewing the world. We just want to make your art better by saying you should look at this through line here, you should look at this tangent line here, and adjust the art so that it is better presented in your subjective way towards the audience without ever noticing that cognitive dissonance that if there's a through line, if there's a tangent line that makes it more susceptible to human perception, there must be a norm somewhere, and that norm must apply to the art, and therefore art must be according to some normalcy, according to a reflection of reality. No, they never recognize that. But the point being is that they always present this as a subjective thing. It's subjective in art itself. That is to say, they never ever acknowledge the fact that you go back to a normal, that you go back to reality, that you depend upon a form. They do it quite specifically in the opposite direction, as to break down the idea of form, and they do it because they're heavy progressives. So if you're doing something that participates in art, if you're listening to a modern song, if you're watching a modern television show, if you're looking at modern sculptures, if you're reading a modern comic book, and you're asking yourself, where's the beauty in this? How come there is nothing beautiful anymore? This is the reason why. We've not only been stripped of all of the understanding of how we can perceive art like that of Walter Simonson or Frank Miller and trace its origins back to what they're trying to do. We've not only been stripped of any understanding of that kind, we're being purposefully stripped of our ability to understand the forms of things and how they exist in reality by being presented degenerate art specifically, and given the reason because it's supposed to lead to progressive, utopian, idealistic futures, but in reality is just meant as a justification on the part of these quote-unquote progressive people of their own personal degeneracy. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. I'm sure there's going to be some beautiful comments on this video. And don't forget, my graphic novels with their quite specifically crafted beautiful art for science fiction, superheroes, and fantasy. The links for those are in the description, so if that sounds appealing to you at all, click on those links in the description or the pinned comment and go on over and see if my graphic novels are for you. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later.